You think you know George Washington, father of a nation? Cherry tree, cannot tell a lie. Wooden teeth and a powdered wig. That's the version they handed you in fourth grade with a coloring sheet and a gold star sticker. But what if that version was just the highlight reel? What if the man who crossed the Delaware and built a country was also complicated, contradictory, and full of secrets that your history textbook quietly skipped right over? Because here's the truth. The real George Washington is far more fascinating than the marble statue version. We're talking a man who made ruthless military decisions, ran a sophisticated spy network, struggled with enormous debt, owned hundreds of enslaved people, and went to extraordinary lengths to keep them, and at times seemed more interested in personal land acquisition than in the ideals he publicly championed. None of that is conspiracy theory. It's documented. It's in his letters, his financial records, his military orders, his estate inventories. The primary sources have always been there. Most people just never get assigned those chapters. So tonight, we're going to go through 50 things about George Washington that your teachers glossed over, your textbooks buried in footnotes, or simply never mentioned at all. Some of these will surprise you, some will genuinely unsettle you. A few might actually make you respect him more, just for entirely different reasons than you expected. Before we get into it, do me a favor, hit subscribe and give this video a like. History content like this doesn't exactly get handed rocket fuel by the algorithm, and I need your help making sure it actually reaches people who want to know the full story, not just the sanitized version. Now get comfortable, turn the lights down low, and let's start at the very beginning. It's 1748. George Washington is 16 years old, and he is already out in the Virginia wilderness doing land surveys for one of the most powerful families in colonial America. Most 16-year-olds at the time were learning a trade or working their father's farm. Washington was mapping territory, sleeping under the stars, navigating frontier terrain, and learning very early that land was power. He wasn't doing this out of academic curiosity. He was doing it because he understood, even at that age, that the men who controlled land in Virginia controlled everything else. This wasn't just a summer job, it was the beginning of a lifelong obsession with acquiring property that would shape nearly every major decision he ever made. By the time he died, Washington owned or controlled tens of thousands of acres spread across multiple states. It started here, at 16, in the Blue Ridge Mountains, with a compass and a very clear vision of what kind of man he intended to become. So let's start with something almost everyone gets wrong. Washington's teeth. You've heard the wooden teeth story. It gets repeated in classrooms, in documentaries, in casual conversation like settled fact. Here's the truth. Washington never had wooden teeth. Not once. Not ever. What he actually had was far stranger and considerably more disturbing. His dentures were constructed from a combination of ivory carved from hippopotamus and elephant tusks, metal alloys, animal teeth, and human teeth. Yes, human teeth. Some of those human teeth almost certainly came from enslaved people at Mount Vernon. Historians have found records suggesting Washington purchased teeth from enslaved individuals, likely under conditions that made refusal difficult or impossible. His dental problems were severe and started early. By the time he was inaugurated as president, he had only one natural tooth remaining in his mouth. The ill-fitting dentures distorted his jaw and affected the way he spoke in public. That somewhat stiff, controlled appearance in portraits, partly the dentures. The wooden teeth myth is almost comforting by comparison. The reality is more complicated, more painful, and connected to the same brutal institution that shadowed nearly every aspect of his life at Mount Vernon. 2. Here's one that surprises people who only know Washington as the general and the president. The man was also a whiskey baron. By 1799, the distillery operating at Mount Vernon was one of the largest whiskey producers in the entire country, churning out around 11,000 gallons in a single year. Washington didn't exactly come up with the idea himself. His farm manager, a Scottish immigrant named James Anderson, convinced him to get into the business after recognizing that Washington's grain operation was perfectly positioned to support large-scale distilling. Washington was skeptical at first, then he saw the profit margins and got very interested very quickly. The distillery ran on the labor of enslaved workers and produced multiple varieties, including rye whiskey, which was the dominant style at the time. It was a serious commercial enterprise, not a gentleman's hobby. Washington invested in expansion, monitored production numbers, and treated it with the same methodical attention he gave to his landholdings. The same man who presided over the Constitutional Convention was also personally overseeing whiskey output reports. History has a way of being more layered than the textbooks suggest, and Washington's distillery is a perfect example of how the founding era was as much about business and profit as it was about liberty and principle. 3. Washington didn't just win battles, he also ran one of the most effective intelligence operations of the Revolutionary War, and he did it quietly enough that most Americans still don't know it existed. The Culper spy ring was a network Washington organized to feed him information about British troop movements, supply lines, and military planning, primarily in and around New York City. The network used invisible ink, coded messages, and dead drop locations to pass intelligence without exposing its members. The operatives used pseudonyms. Washington himself was assigned a number in the communication chain. This wasn't amateur hour. It was a disciplined, compartmentalized intelligence operation that would look recognizable to anyone familiar with modern tradecraft. Key figures included Abraham Woodhull, who operated under the name Samuel Culper Sr., and Robert Townsend, who moved through British-occupied New York gathering information while appearing to be a loyalist merchant. The ring helped Washington make critical strategic decisions and is credited with exposing at least one significant British operation. Washington understood something that the textbooks rarely emphasize. Wars aren't only won with muskets, they're won with information. The same man celebrated for his battlefield leadership was simultaneously running a shadow operation that modern intelligence historians study with genuine admiration. And speaking of things Washington managed with careful, deliberate control, the story of what he built at Mount Vernon goes far beyond the distillery. 4. Before Washington ever became president, he faced a crisis that could have shattered the fragile idea of American democracy before it even started. In 1783, as the Revolutionary War was winding down, a group of Continental Army officers stationed at Newburgh, New York, were furious. They hadn't been paid in months, their pensions were uncertain, and Congress seemed indifferent to their sacrifice. Some of them began quietly talking about using the Army's power to pressure Congress, maybe even to refuse to disband until they got what they wanted. In other words, the kind of military pressure that turns republics into something else. Anonymous letters circulated, urging officers to meet and consider taking coordinated action against civilian leaders. Washington got wind of it. He could have sided with his loyal, unpaid officers. Instead, he showed up at their gathering unannounced. He delivered a calm, measured speech reminding them what they'd been fighting for, not just pay, but a new kind of nation where the military answered to civilians, not the other way around. Then he did something small that carried enormous weight. Struggling to read a letter from Congress, he paused, pulled out a new pair of spectacles and apologized, saying he had grown gray and nearly blind in the service of his country. The room fell silent. Hardened officers reportedly wept. The drama wasn't about theatrics, it was about trust. Washington appealed to their honor, not their anger. The potential mutiny evaporated. The army did not march on Congress. The war ended without a military coup. In that quiet moment at Newburgh, Washington made a choice that set a precedent. In this new republic, the general would serve the civilian government, not rule over it. For a world used to victorious commanders seizing power, that decision was almost revolutionary in itself. 5. When you picture the founding fathers, you might imagine polished men steeped in classical training, quoting Latin from elite universities. Washington doesn't quite fit that image. Unlike John Adams, who went to Harvard, or James Madison, who attended what became Princeton, George Washington never went to college. He didn't study law formally like many of his peers. He didn't spend years in lecture halls debating philosophy and political theory. His formal schooling effectively ended in his early teens. His father died when he was young, and the family simply didn't have the same resources or connections to send him overseas or to a colonial college. Instead of university lectures, Washington had something else, an almost obsessive commitment to self-improvement. As a teenager, he painstakingly copied out a collection of maxims known as the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. They weren't deep philosophy. They were essentially a list of how to carry yourself, how to speak, how to control your temper and your image. He read manuals on agriculture, studied military treatises, and constantly asked advice from people he considered more educated. He learned through doing, managing land, watching surveyors, leading men, and making mistakes in the field instead of in classrooms. That lack of formal education shaped him in subtle ways. He was not a soaring writer like Jefferson, and he often relied on others to draft elegant language. His letters could be stiff and practical, almost businesslike, but it also meant he approached problems with a methodical, hands-on mindset. He surrounded himself with people who had skills he lacked, and listened more than he talked. His reputation for dignity and restraint wasn't an accident. It was the product of a man who knew very early that he was not the most classically educated person in the room and compensated by mastering discipline, image, and decision-making. The myth of the flawless genius founder fades a little here, replaced by something more human. A man who built himself deliberately piece by piece, without a college degree to frame it. 6. Long before he commanded armies or presided over a new government, Washington had a job that put him out on the edges of the map. As a teenager, he became a surveyor, trekking through the rough, unsettled landscapes of colonial Virginia, measuring and mapping land for wealthy landowners and speculators. This wasn't a desk job. It meant days on horseback, nights in primitive camps, and work in territories where boundaries were vague and disputes could turn violent. He learned how hills, rivers, and forests actually looked and felt, not just as lines on a page. His first official appointment came when he was around 17, as a county surveyor in what was then frontier territory. The work paid reasonably well, especially for someone his age, and it gave him something even more valuable than money: a first-hand understanding of land, geography, and the economics of property. He saw up close how land speculation worked, how claims were staked, and how indigenous territories were steadily carved up and redefined by colonial authorities. Those early experiences shaped his later life in ways most textbooks barely mention. His obsession with land ownership, his expansive holdings, and his constant eye on Western territories were rooted in those teenage years with compass and chain in hand. When he later planned military campaigns, his familiarity with terrain and distances wasn't abstract. He had literally walked the ground. The frontier didn't appear to him as a mysterious blank space. It was a place he'd sweated through, measured, and monetized. That early career as a surveyor also taught him something about social hierarchies. He worked for powerful men, noted how they operated, and learned how property and status intertwined in colonial society. Washington's later role as a massive landowner and political figure is easier to understand when you remember where he started, a young man on the frontier, translating raw landscape into lines on paper, already thinking about what land could become and who would control it. 7. Before Washington was the calm, gray-haired figure on the dollar bill, he was a very ambitious young officer sent into a powder keg. In 1753, at just 21 years old, the governor of Virginia picked him for a risky mission into the Ohio Valley, a region where British, French, and multiple native nations all claimed influence. On paper, the job sounded straightforward: travel hundreds of miles through winter wilderness, find the French forts, deliver a message telling them to leave land the British crown said was theirs, and then calmly report back. In reality, it meant walking into a tense, layered conflict that stretched far beyond anything Washington understood at the time. The Ohio Valley was not empty frontier. It was home to powerful native confederacies trying to navigate between European empires that constantly promised alliance and delivered betrayal. Washington carried orders written by colonial elites who saw the West as speculation opportunity, not as someone's homeland. When he arrived, the French officers politely listened, politely refused, and wrote their own report saying they had no intention of leaving. Washington dutifully took notes, measured distances, and sketched forts, believing this was all a local contest over land and prestige. What he stumbled into instead was the opening move of a global war. His mission, and what followed, fed into the chain of events that triggered the French and Indian War in North America, which merged into the 7 Years' War in Europe, a conflict some historians call the First True World War. Within a few years, battles that began in dense Ohio forests would echo in the Caribbean, India, and on the high seas. Washington didn't start that global fire alone, but his footsteps into the snow-covered Ohio Valley, letters in his pack, helped strike one of the first sparks. 8. Not long after that first mission, Washington got another chance to prove himself, and it went badly enough to haunt him for life. In 1754, tensions in the Ohio Valley escalated fast. British colonial authorities wanted a show of force. The French were building forts, and native groups were watching both sides maneuver. Washington, now a young major hungry for advancement, led a small Virginia force into the contested territory, built a crude circular stockade he named Fort Necessity, and waited for events to unfold. The name sounded confident. The reality was mud, poor drainage, and flimsy defenses in a low, swampy meadow. When a French force, accompanied by native allies, moved against him, the weather turned against Washington too. Rain soaked the ground, turned trenches into ditches of standing water, and ruined much of the colonists' gunpowder. Washington's men were outnumbered, soaked, hungry, and increasingly surrounded. Through the day-long fight, casualties mounted and ammunition dwindled. In the end, Washington agreed to surrender, the only time in his military career he formally capitulated to an enemy. The French drafted the terms in their language. Washington, who did not read French, relied on translators. He signed a document that not only ceded the poorly chosen fort, but, according to many historians, contained an admission of responsibility for the death of a French officer killed days earlier. The surrender allowed Washington and his men to march away, their dignity dented, their reputation damaged. British authorities downplayed the embarrassment. The French saw it as useful propaganda. For Washington personally, Fort Necessity was a harsh education in logistics, terrain, and the consequences of overconfidence. The man later praised for calculating retreats and defensive lines, started with a muddy, leaky fort in a field he should never have chosen. In quiet moments years later, when he advised caution or insisted on stronger positions, that rain-soaked defeat in the Ohio Valley was part of the memory bank guiding him. 9. To understand why that frontier clash became so explosive, you have to zoom in on one particular encounter that still unsettles historians. Before the siege of Fort Necessity, Washington led a small detachment of colonial troops and native allies on a reconnaissance mission through thick woods and steep ravines. With him was Harrison, often called the Half-King, a native leader who had his own reasons for opposing the French. Early one morning in late May 1754, Washington's party discovered a French encampment hidden in a rocky hollow. What happened next became known as the Jumonville Incident, named after the French officer in charge, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. Shots were fired. The French claimed they were on a diplomatic mission carrying papers rather than preparing for battle. Washington reported that a skirmish broke out after his men were spotted, and that his forces fired first only after being discovered. The fight lasted minutes. When it ended, Jumonville was dead, along with several of his men. According to some accounts, including later French testimony, Jumonville may have been wounded and captured before being killed, possibly by Harrison, who is said to have struck him and allegedly declared that he was avenging past French actions. Other versions of the incident question those details, arguing that recollections were distorted by propaganda and the need to assign blame. Was Jumonville a diplomat ambushed under a flag of truce, or a military scout whose presence justified attack? Was Washington leading a legitimate preemptive strike, or did he become, unwillingly or not, part of an assassination framed as battle? The documents from each side don't fully agree, and historians still debate intent and sequence. What's less disputed is the impact. The French used Jumonville's death to portray the British, and by extension Washington, as violators of diplomatic norms. His half-brother later led a retaliatory attack against Washington at Fort Necessity. A confusing, rainy shootout in a forest clearing became a diplomatic flashpoint that hardened positions on both sides. Washington later tried to explain and defend his actions, but the Jumonville incident remained a politically sensitive stain on his early record, a reminder that the path to his later fame ran straight through an ambiguous killing in the woods that helped turn colonial rivalry into continent-wide war. 10. By the time Washington rode into the catastrophe later called Braddock's defeat, he already knew how quickly a small skirmish could spiral into something much larger. but nothing in his brief, brutal education had prepared him for what happened in those Pennsylvania woods in July 1755. British General Edward Braddock marched nearly 1,400 redcoats and colonial troops in tight European formation through dense forest, drums and flags and rigid discipline pressing into terrain that didn't care about ceremony. Washington, serving as a volunteer aide, was recovering from a severe illness and had to ride in a covered wagon just to stay with the column. When French and native forces ambushed the marching army along a narrow track, the result was chaos that looked more like a slaughter than a battle. Red-coated soldiers trained to fight in open fields fired blindly into the trees and, at times, into their own colonial allies. Officers on horseback became obvious targets. Men fell in clumps, smoke thickened, and the road clogged with dead, dying, and panicked survivors trying to flee. Washington rode back and forth through the gunfire carrying Braddock's orders, trying to form some kind of defensive stand out of men who felt like the forest itself was attacking. Braddock was eventually shot and mortally wounded. Nearly the entire officer corps was killed or hit, and the advance simply collapsed. After the battle, Washington discovered bullet holes in his coat and had horses shot out from under him, yet he was somehow untouched. Later writers, especially in the 19th century, turned this into a near-mystical episode, claiming native warriors supposedly remarked they could not kill him and spinning tales of divine protection hovering over the young Virginian. The more sober version is that he was very lucky in a very deadly place, and that survival in the middle of such carnage reinforced something already forming in his mind, that British regular tactics could fail catastrophically in American terrain, that colonial officers were not inherently inferior to officers with royal commissions, and that living through disaster was its own kind of training. The legend of the bullets that missed him fed his reputation, but what stayed with him more practically was the memory of an army shattered because it would not adapt, and the terrifying knowledge of just how fast order could dissolve when commanders lost control. 11 years later, when he commanded the Continental Army, Washington faced a different kind of enemy that didn't carry muskets or march in formation, and this time the threat was as much inside his own lines as beyond them. Smallpox was ripping through North America in the 1770s, killing or scarring huge numbers of people, and especially dangerous in crowded military camps where recruits from different regions mixed, slept close, and shared food, blankets, and air. Washington had seen smallpox up close as a young man during a trip to Barbados, where he caught the disease himself, survived, and was left with immunity and pockmarked skin. That experience gave him something powerful but unnerving: personal knowledge that the virus could both devastate and, if endured, confer protection. As the war dragged on, outbreaks periodically ravaged American troops, sometimes sidelining more men than British musket fire. Inoculation at the time wasn't vaccination as we think of it today. It usually meant deliberately introducing material from an infected person into a healthy one through cuts in the skin, hoping for a milder case and long-term immunity. The procedure could still kill, temporarily incapacitate entire units, and spread the disease if not carefully managed. It was controversial, feared, and in some colonies even restricted by law. Washington hesitated at first, balancing the risk of losing soldiers to the procedure against the certainty of losing them to uncontrolled outbreaks. But he also understood a quiet reality. An army periodically crippled by disease could not fight a sustained war for independence. In 1777, he made a decision as radical, in its own way, as any battlefield maneuver. He ordered a systematic program of smallpox inoculation for Continental troops, especially new recruits, under controlled conditions. This meant setting up inoculation sites, quarantining recovering soldiers, staggering the process so the army would not be incapacitated all at once, and enforcing measures that many men feared or mistrusted. The move was not universally popular. Some contemporaries thought it reckless or even immoral, exposing soldiers deliberately to a potentially deadly pathogen. Yet over time, the policy sharply reduced the impact of smallpox within the Continental ranks, compared to what it might have been, and helped prevent the kind of epidemic that could have destroyed the army from the inside. Historians sometimes point out that this decision may have been one of the most consequential strategic choices of the war, almost invisible in paintings and patriotic myths, because it happened in hospitals and makeshift infirmaries instead of on dramatic, smoke-filled battlefields. Washington, who often gets remembered for daring winter marches and flanking moves, quietly embraced a medically risky, administratively complex plan that treated disease prevention as a form of warfare. Long before germ theory, he approached contagion like an enemy that could be anticipated, managed, and contained, even if victory required temporarily wounding his own forces. 12. When people picture Washington crossing the Delaware, they usually see the famous painting. Heroic figures standing in a boat carving through ice. A single night of courage frozen into one image that looks almost serene if you forget the freezing water and the very real chance of drowning. The reality was messier, colder, and part of a broader, desperate campaign rather than a one-off gamble. By late 1776, the Continental Army had been driven out of New York, chased across New Jersey, and pressed up against the Delaware River with morale and enlistments collapsing. Many soldiers had no proper shoes, leaving bloody footprints in the snow. British and Hessian forces thought the rebellion was nearly finished. Some officers wrote confidently that it would only take a little more pressure to crush what remained. Washington's decision to strike back involved not just one crossing but a coordinated plan. Multiple columns were supposed to cross the icy river at different points, move through a winter storm at night, and converge on enemy positions in New Jersey. The weather turned vicious, with sleet, snow, and wind hammering men, trying to move artillery and horses onto flat-bottomed boats. Ice floes jammed the river, threatening to tip or smash vessels. Timetables slipped badly. Some planned crossings failed entirely when units simply could not get over the river or navigate in the dark under those conditions. The famous successful crossing that led to the surprise attack on Trenton was only one piece of this larger operation, implemented by men who were exhausted, half-frozen, and very aware that if the attack failed, retreat might be impossible and capture or death likely. After Trenton, Washington did not simply stop and bask in victory. He recrossed the river, then crossed again, maneuvering in a tense series of moves that included the Battle of Assunpink Creek and the bold march to Princeton, constantly weighing the risk of being pinned and destroyed against the need to keep momentum and show the revolution was not dead. The winter campaign around the Delaware was less a single roll of the dice and more a string of linked risks, improvised adjustments, and near misses that could have snapped at multiple points. The iconic boat scene condenses all of that into one frozen moment, but the hidden truth is that the crossing of the Delaware was really a fracturing, grinding sequence of operations through storms, confusion, and borderline mutiny. Washington's coolness under that kind of accumulating pressure, his willingness to move toward danger when retreat seemed safer in the short term, and his ability to extract not just one victory, but a small campaign out of a collapsing year, helped keep the revolution alive long enough for later, more familiar triumphs to be possible. 13. By the morning after Trenton, people like to remember the tidy headline version of events. Washington crosses icy river, surprises Hessians, wins battle, but what actually made that victory so jarring to everyone who heard about it was how completely it flipped the emotional script of the war in a single violent sleet-soaked morning. The Continental Army went into the operation at its lowest point, enlistments about to expire, desertions rising, Congress fleeing Philadelphia, and newspaper writers already composing the revolution's obituary. Many of the men who trudged toward Trenton on Christmas night were exhausted, hungry, and thinking less about glory than about how soon their formal obligation to this collapsing project would be legally over. Washington's plan hinged on more than just surprise. It depended on the enemy being relaxed enough during a holiday to underrate him, and on his own half-frozen troops being disciplined enough not to fire too early or break into scattered looting once they hit town. The Hessian garrison in Trenton, commanded by Colonel Johann Rall, was indeed caught off guard, but not because they were drunken caricatures sleeping off a feast. They'd been skirmishing and on edge for days, and a winter storm just convinced them nothing big would happen that night. When American columns finally hit the town at dawn, artillery blasted down the main streets, infantry pushed hard through alleys, and the fighting was close, loud, and chaotic, but coordinated enough that Hessian attempts to form up were quickly shredded. The casualties in terms of raw numbers were relatively small by later war standards, yet symbolically enormous. Hundreds of prisoners, captured muskets and supplies, and, more importantly, a visible, undeniable proof that Washington could do more than just retreat in an orderly fashion. News of the victory raced along the coast, and for men whose enlistments were about to expire, the taste of success made the idea of walking away feel suddenly like abandoning something that might actually work. Washington seized that psychological opening, pleading with soldiers to stay 1 month longer, sometimes offering bounties out of money he didn't really have, and many did. Trenton, in that sense, wasn't just a tactical win. It was a carefully timed shock to a dying cause's nervous system, jolting it back into motion at the last possible moment. 14. If Trenton was the spark that relit the fire, Princeton was the moment Washington walked straight through the flames to keep it burning. And the story of that battle tends to get boiled down to a single, almost cinematic image: Washington on horseback, riding between two collapsing lines while musket balls whip past him, rallying men who are already starting to break. What led to that moment was a days-long cat-and-mouse game with a British army that thought it was about to snuff him out for good. After the second engagement at Trenton, where Washington held a defensive line behind Assunpink Creek, British General Charles Cornwallis believed he had the Americans trapped against the river and planned to finish them in the morning. Instead, Washington left campfires burning and slipped his army away on a night march, taking back roads through freezing mud and darkness to get around the British flank and strike at Princeton, where smaller enemy detachments were posted. The march itself was exhausting, with men stumbling from lack of sleep, ice slicking the roads, and the constant fear that a stray British patrol would discover the maneuver and ruin everything. At dawn, when American units approaching Princeton collided with British regulars under Colonel Charles Mawhood, the battlefield fractured quickly. Some American militia began to give way under disciplined volleys, and for a few minutes, the pattern that had defined so many earlier defeats, raw troops cracking under pressure from trained redcoats, started to repeat. Washington responded not by pulling back to preserve his own safety, but by riding directly into the danger zone, placing his horse between the retreating Americans and the advancing British, calling to his men to stand and fire. Several accounts describe officers covering their eyes or turning away, assuming they were about to watch their commander get cut down at point-blank range. Instead, volleys were exchanged. Washington remained unhit, and the psychological effect was immediate. Men who moments earlier had been drifting backward suddenly steadied, wheeled, and joined a counterattack that pushed the British line back and eventually forced them to abandon Princeton. The victory wasn't huge in terms of territory, but strategically it rattled British confidence in their ability to pin Washington down and convinced many skeptics that the Continental Army could outmaneuver Imperial forces rather than just run from them. For civilians watching from a distance, the quick sequence of Trenton and Princeton felt like proof that the disaster of 1776 had not permanently fixed American fortunes in place. For Washington, who had just spent months managing retreat after retreat, Princeton validated a dangerous instinct that sometimes the only way to escape a trap is to move directly toward what looks like the most dangerous opening and trust that your own presence under fire can bend a collapsing line back into shape. 15. The name Valley Forge tends to conjure only one image in popular memory: barefoot soldiers shivering in snow, a kind of frozen martyrdom scene, but the cold and hunger, as brutal as they were, aren't the whole story of what actually happened there or why it mattered so much to the army Washington led. When the Continental Army went into winter quarters in December 1777 after a campaign marked by defeats around Philadelphia, they were not just tired, they were structurally disorganized, with uneven training, inconsistent supply systems, and an officer corps that mixed genuine talent with political appointees and local notables whose main qualification was social standing. The encampment at Valley Forge itself was not a prison camp. Washington chose the location because it was close enough to watch the British in Philadelphia, but far enough to avoid sudden attack, with access to surrounding farmland and defensible high ground. The suffering came less from the raw temperature and more from slow, grinding failures in logistics and procurement. Shoes that never arrived, meat that spoiled before reaching camp, clothing promised by state governments that remained on paper. Disease, including typhus, dysentery, and smallpox, killed more men than frostbite, and the daily reality for soldiers was a mix of construction work building huts, standing guard, drilling in the snow, and trying not to die from infections in cramped, smoky shelters. Into this misery stepped Baron Friedrich von Steuben, a former Prussian officer whose exaggerated resume and colorful personal life made some Americans wary, but whose practical understanding of drilling large bodies of men proved invaluable. With Washington's backing, von Steuben introduced a more standardized training regimen, rewriting clumsy existing manuals into a clear, usable blue book and personally walking through new maneuvers with lines of soldiers, cursing in multiple languages and having his translators convert his outbursts into more polite instructions. Instead of each regiment doing things its own way, companies began to practice the same methods for loading, firing, wheeling, and forming columns, which meant that different parts of the army could finally move and fight together with something like professional cohesion. Washington also used the Valley Forge period to push administrative reforms, tightening record keeping, prodding Congress and state officials for more reliable supply arrangements, and trying to reshape promotion systems so that competence mattered at least as much as connections. By the time the army emerged in the spring of 1778 and met British forces at Monmouth, they were still hungry, still under-equipped, but noticeably more disciplined and resilient under fire, able to execute controlled volleys and battlefield maneuvers that would have been far shakier a year earlier. Valley Forge didn't magically transform a starving, muttering encampment into a perfect European-style force, and misery there was real enough that desertion and resignations never entirely stopped, but beneath the iconic suffering was a quieter transformation. The winter that popular imagination treats as a static tableau of endurance was also an administrative and tactical workshop, where Washington and his subordinates used the forced pause of bad weather to rewire an improvised rebellion's army into something closer to a standing force, capable not just of surviving another campaign, but of meeting the British in the open and not immediately collapsing. 16. When people picture the transformation at Valley Forge, they usually fast forward straight to the parade ground version of events. Files of men snapping through precise maneuvers on command, muskets rising and falling in perfect rhythm, drums and fifes suddenly sounding like they belonged to a real army instead of a scattered collection of militias. But that polish was the end of a process that began with Washington making an almost counterintuitive bet on an outsider with a dubious resume and no obvious political backing. Baron Friedrich von Steuben showed up in America as a kind of walking question mark. A former Prussian officer who claimed experience on Frederick the Great's staff carried letters of introduction from Benjamin Franklin that politely exaggerated his importance, and arrived with a small entourage, a flair for dramatic uniforms, and barely enough English to swear properly. What Washington saw in him wasn't social pedigree or ideological purity, but a solution to a very specific problem. The Continental Army didn't just need bravery, it needed a common language of movement and fire that would allow men from Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania to act as interchangeable parts in the middle of chaos. Washington gave von Steuben room to experiment, and instead of starting with the entire army, the Prussian focused on a single model company, drilling them obsessively in basic tasks: how to load faster without fumbling, how to wheel and change front without dissolving into a knot, how to keep ranks solid even when the instinct was to hunch, flinch, and drift backward under musket fire. The spectacle of this one unit suddenly moving with crisp efficiency had a contagious effect. Officers who had previously guarded their own local habits began copying the new methods. Soldiers started to take pride in executing moves they knew British observers would recognize as professional, and Washington now had something he had not enjoyed since the war began: a standardized set of instructions he could expect any part of his force to understand. Von Steuben's Blue Book, crafted out of that winter's experiments and frustrations, gave Washington a tool that outlived the misery of Valley Forge, pages of clear, practical guidance that outlasted the war itself and helped define how American armies would drill for decades. The real partnership between Washington and von Steuben wasn't just commander and drill master. It was a quiet alliance between a leader who understood that raw courage was not enough, and a technician who could translate that courage into coordinated action, turning scattered endurance into something that looked, from a distance, like a professional fighting force. 17. By the time the war story arcs toward Yorktown in most retellings, it often gets flattened into a kind of inevitability. France shows up with ships. Washington marches south. The British get trapped, and the curtain falls as if the whole thing were a neat, pre-written finale. But what made Yorktown so precariously impressive was how many moving parts had to align in a narrow window, and how much of Washington's role involved tempering his own long-standing instincts in order to make that alignment possible. For years, Washington had been obsessed, almost to the point of fixation, with the idea of launching a decisive blow against British forces in New York, the city they had seized early and turned into a fortified hub for operations. He knew the terrain, had threaded his way through its waters and islands in 1776, and felt that retaking it would deliver a symbolic and strategic reversal, powerful enough to justify enormous risk. When French troops under Rochambeau finally arrived in meaningful numbers and, more importantly, when a French fleet under Admiral de Grasse became available in the Caribbean, Washington initially pushed hard to use them against New York, sketching out plans and walking French officers across maps of the harbor. But the French were blunt. New York was too well defended, its waters too complicated, and the chances of coordinating land and naval forces there without catastrophe were slim. What followed was less a moment of inspiration than of restraint. Washington listened, recalculated, and allowed himself to be persuaded that the real opportunity lay not in reclaiming his personal white whale, but in striking at Lord Cornwallis's army in Virginia, where British forces were more exposed, and the geographic chessboard favored a temporary French command of the sea. To make that work, he had to orchestrate a deceptive march, leaving elements in the north to make New York's British garrison think an attack there was still imminent, while moving the bulk of Franco-American forces hundreds of miles south along difficult roads, all while hoping that de Grasse's fleet would arrive in the Chesapeake before the Royal Navy could concentrate there. The coordination that followed, French ships bottling up the bay, French and American troops converging on land, siege lines creeping steadily closer to British works, depended on a level of trust and shared planning that would have been unthinkable earlier in the war, when American leaders were still painfully aware of how much they needed European support and how easily they could be sidelined. At Yorktown, Washington was still the visible leader, directing batteries and overseeing the dig of parallel trenches, but the geometry of victory rested on equal parts French timing and American persistence, and he knew it. That final, thunderous siege that most people remember as the war's climax was really a delicate balancing act, Washington suppressing his impulse to gamble everything on New York, accepting that someone else's ships would decide where he could win, and then pouring all of his accumulated experience with marches, encirclements, and morale into one sustained effort to make sure that for once, every Allied piece arrived exactly where it was supposed to be before the British realized the trap had fully closed. 18. After Yorktown, the popular imagination glides straight to fireworks and treaties, as if victory on a Virginia bluff automatically dissolved armies and shooed everyone back to their farms. But the uncomfortable reality Washington understood in the months and years that followed was that nothing about power gives itself up neatly, and victorious generals in the 18th century almost never stepped away just because the shooting had slowed. The Continental Army lingered in a long, tense limbo, unpaid officers nursing a sense of betrayal, enlisted men still in rough camps, Congress broke and weak, and rumors swirling that maybe the easiest way to stabilize this fragile new thing called the United States would be to keep the army together under a strong hand, possibly even under Washington himself, until civilian politicians grew up enough to govern. Twice, those tensions veered close to something like a soft military takeover. At Newburgh in 1783, officers, furious over unpaid promises, circulated letters hinting that they might refuse to disband or even march on Congress if their grievances remained ignored, and some outside sympathizers openly suggested that Washington should simply accept a crown, or at least a permanent quasi-monarchical role, on the logic that he had already earned it. Washington's response in those moments, summoning his officers, speaking quietly of duty, pulling out a pair of spectacles and apologizing that he had grown gray in the service of his country, helped diffuse the immediate crisis, but it did not automatically remove his own potential as a figure who could override institutions just by nodding. That is what made his decision in December 1783 to travel to Annapolis, where Congress was meeting, and formally resign his commission so surprising to European observers. He didn't just step down, he did it publicly, ceremonially, presenting his authority as something that had always belonged to the people's representatives and was now being returned to them intact. In a less dramatic, more procedural world, this might have passed as a routine change of command, but in a political culture still saturated with examples of victorious generals turning into kings or dictators, Cromwell in England, Caesar in Rome, countless smaller coups across the continent, Washington's quiet exit read as almost bizarre. Some foreign commentators reportedly assumed it was a temporary gesture or a clever tactic, and waited for him to reclaim power once the civilian government inevitably faltered. Instead, he went home to Mount Vernon, leaving behind a precedent that would cling to his name even more tightly than his battlefield maneuvers. The idea that in this new republic, military glory was something you were expected to walk away from before it fused with political control. That moment in Annapolis, with Washington handing over his commission and stepping back into private life, was less theatrical than Yorktown's roar of cannon. But for people paying attention to how revolutions usually end, it was the more astonishing act, the voluntary surrender of power, at the very moment when keeping it would have been easiest and most widely excused. 19. When Washington returned to public life as presiding officer of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, the drama wasn't in fiery speeches or table-pounding arguments by almost every surviving account. He said remarkably little during the debates themselves, but in the gravitational pull of his presence, which settled over the room like an unspoken set of rules about what this whole experiment was supposed to look like. Delegates who mistrusted each other still trusted him. Men who feared that any strong central government would just morph into a new monarchy were also painfully aware that the only person in America everyone seemed to accept as a potential monarch had already walked away from power once, and was now sitting in the chair at the front of the room. That odd combination, heroic stature, visible self-restraint, and a reputation for doing the difficult, anti-glamorous thing when it mattered, gave the proceedings a legitimacy no parchment or procedural rule could manufacture. It's not that Washington secretly controlled the outcome. Madison, Hamilton, and others drafted the bones of the document. Fierce arguments raged over representation and slavery, and compromises he might have personally disliked were hammered into the text anyway. What his quiet role did was narrow the emotional range of the gathering. It made open talk of breaking up the Union or staging walkouts feel like betrayal, not just of an abstract project, but of a man who had already bled for its first version. Foreign observers later noted that one reason the new Constitution, with all its flaws, had a chance at ratification was that Americans could imagine it being carried into existence by a figure they associated with reluctant authority rather than raw ambition. Washington's near silence at the convention was not a void. It was a constant reminder that the most powerful man in the room had already demonstrated that he did not crave more power for its own sake, and that subtle fact calmed just enough nerves for a contentious blueprint of government to emerge without flying apart. 20. By the time the Constitution had been patched together and sent out to the states to sink or swim under public scrutiny, there was a quiet, almost embarrassed consensus among political leaders that if this new executive office called the presidency was going to work at all, it would have to start with a one person who could walk into it without looking like he had schemed to get there, which is how Washington ended up becoming the only president in U.S. history to be chosen unanimously by the Electoral College twice, without ever mounting anything that resembled a modern campaign. He did not barnstorm. He did not publish manifestos promising sweeping reforms. He spent more energy trying to signal reluctance than eagerness, writing letters that sounded like a man half hoping to be spared the burden, even as everyone around him treated his acceptance as a kind of non-negotiable requirement for national survival. The unanimity wasn't a mass outbreak of personal adoration so much as a nervous political calculation shared across factions. Federalists who wanted a strong central government believed Washington's reputation could soften fears of tyranny. Skeptics who worried about centralized power believed that, if someone had to occupy this new, vaguely monarchical-sounding office, it was safest to hand it to the man who had twice demonstrated he could step away from command. In that sense, the unanimous votes in 1789 and 1792 said as much about anxieties as admiration. They were less a coronation than a collective attempt to build guardrails out of one person's character, hoping that the template he set would outlast his lifetime. The irony is that Washington understood how fragile that logic was. He wrote openly about the dangers of factions, the volatility of public opinion, and the impossibility of pleasing every region at once, and he accepted the presidency knowing that the very aura that made him a unifying figure would start to erode the moment real policy decisions forced people to take sides. Those spotless Electoral College tallies, often presented now as proof of a simpler, more united era, actually marked the high point before the fractures deepened, a moment when Americans tried to postpone the messy work of partisan politics by hiding behind a leader they hoped could be both above the fray and somehow effective within it. 21. Once in office, Washington faced a strangely blank landscape, because the Constitution that had been fought over line by line said surprisingly little about how a president was actually supposed to run the executive branch day to day, leaving him to improvise basic habits that later generations would mistake for inevitable traditions, and one of the most consequential of those improvisations was the creation of a cabinet, a small circle of department heads he met with regularly to debate, argue, and hash out what the new government should actually do. On paper, Congress created the departments, State, Treasury, War, and later others, each headed by a secretary who was technically answerable to the president. In practice, Washington chose human beings with clashing temperaments and philosophies, Hamilton, Jefferson, Knox, Randolph, and then invited them into an inner sanctum where they could tear into each other's ideas under his watchful eye. There was nothing in the Constitution requiring this specific arrangement. He could have demanded written opinions only, or dealt with each secretary in isolation, or leaned entirely on the Senate for advice and consent the way some framers had vaguely imagined. Instead, he assembled these competing voices around a table and made them talk to one another, partly because he valued hearing arguments in person, and partly because he understood that if the presidency became a lonely, opaque decision-making island, suspicion of monarchy would ignite overnight. The cabinet quickly became more than a convenience. It was an unwritten answer to the question of how a single elected executive could exercise enormous power without seeming to rule by personal whim. Of course, the same setup that gave Washington a balanced stream of counsel also exposed the emerging rift between Hamilton's vision of a robust, finance-driven federal state and Jefferson's dream of a more agrarian, decentralized republic, and those arguments leaking out of the cabinet room helped harden the first-party lines in American politics. But the deeper precedent he set wasn't about which faction won on any given issue. It was the idea that presidents would surround themselves with appointed specialists, subject them to internal debate, and then own the final decision. A formula so familiar now that it's easy to forget it began as one man's pragmatic attempt to make this new office feel less like a throne and more like the nerve center of a government that, at least in theory, answered to more than a single will. 22. When war broke out between revolutionary France and Britain in the early 1790s, it didn't arrive on America's doorstep as an abstract debate about distant philosophies. It crashed into the fragile young republic through sailors' pay, merchants' insurance rates, and the half-remembered trauma of having just clawed independence out of a British Empire that still had forts on American soil and warships prowling the Atlantic. Washington's instinct, shaped by years of watching how quickly military conflicts devoured treasuries and moral certainty alike, was that the new United States couldn't afford to pick a side in a global brawl, no matter how many citizens cheered for the French Revolution as a sequel to their own or clung to Britain as an essential trading partner. So in 1793, he issued the Proclamation of Neutrality, a dry-sounding document that quietly did something radical. It asserted that the United States would remain friendly and impartial to both France and Britain, warned Americans not to sign up for foreign privateering schemes, and claimed for the executive branch the power to declare the nation's stance in a crisis even when Congress hadn't formally weighed in. Critics accused him of betraying the spirit of the alliance with France that had helped win the Revolutionary War, and Jefferson's allies fumed that neutrality in the face of a war for liberty was moral cowardice dressed up as prudence. But Washington saw something they didn't want to look at directly, that the country's economy depended heavily on British commerce. Its army was tiny, its navy was almost non-existent, and any serious entanglement could end with American cities burned and the experiment in constitutional government strangled in its crib. The proclamation didn't magically keep American ships from being seized or diplomats from being insulted. It didn't stop citizens from arguing in taverns about guillotines and kings. What it did was buy time. A few crucial years in which the national debt could be organized, the administrative machinery could be assembled, and the government could learn to function without being yanked around like a puppet by European great powers. Foreign ministries in London and Paris sometimes misread neutrality as weakness or opportunism, and posterity has argued over whether Washington overstepped by acting unilaterally. But inside his own correspondence, the logic is stark. He believed that if the United States plunged into that war on either side, it might not survive long enough to have the luxury of regretting the decision. 23. If Washington's Neutrality Proclamation was his attempt to keep European storms at arm's length, the Whiskey Rebellion showed him what thunder sounded like inside his own borders, where the question wasn't abstract foreign entanglements, but whether the federal government could actually make its laws stick once people decided they didn't like them. In the early 1790s, Alexander Hamilton's financial plan included an excise tax on distilled spirits, a seemingly technocratic revenue measure that in practice hit small frontier farmers in western Pennsylvania and elsewhere hardest, because they often turned surplus grain into whiskey. It was more portable, more profitable, and in many places functioned as a kind of currency. To men already suspicious of Eastern elites and distant authorities, A tax collector knocking on the door felt less like sober fiscal policy and more like the British all over again. And the resistance escalated from petitions to intimidation to outright violence. Revenue officers were tarred and feathered, court proceedings were disrupted, and armed crowds began to look more like insurrection than local protest. Washington watched the reports pile up with a mixture of reluctance and grim recognition. He had led a rebellion against a government that refused to listen, and now he sat atop a government that would collapse into a joke if it responded to armed defiance by shrugging. After legal steps, proclamations, warnings, the usual slow machinery failed to calm things down, he did something no other sitting president has done since. He personally rode out to review the militia forces called up from several states. Tens of thousands of men mobilized, not to fight a foreign army, but to enforce a domestically passed tax law. He didn't lead them into battle like at Trenton. By the time the force pressed west, the show of strength was enough that the main resistance melted away, ringleaders scattered, and only a handful of participants were tried and convicted. 2 even received presidential pardons from the same man whose government they had challenged. To some Americans, especially in the Jeffersonian camp, the episode looked like an alarming rehearsal of government overreaction, a chance for Federalists to play soldier against their own people and flex centralized muscle. To Washington, it was the minimum necessary demonstration that Republican government was not a voluntary suggestion box, but a system in which laws passed under the Constitution could not be nullified by regional mobs with muskets. The quiet, almost anticlimactic end of the crisis disguised how pivotal it was. If the federal response had fizzled, or if frontier resistance had hardened into a separate authority, the United States might have dissolved into a patchwork of semi-sovereign enclaves before the nation had even finished learning how to count its own population. Instead, the message that drifted back east and across the Atlantic was that this strange new republic, however argumentative on paper, could and would back up its statutes with organized power when pushed. 24. The same determination to keep the United States out of catastrophic war that drove Washington's Neutrality Proclamation led him, late in his presidency, into what became one of the most fiercely criticized decisions of his career, supporting the Jade Treaty with Britain, a document that read like a bundle of technical clauses about debts, ship seizures, and frontier forts, but struck many Americans as a humiliating capitulation to their former imperial master. By the mid-1790s, British forces still occupied posts in the Northwest Territory in violation of the peace treaty. Royal Navy captains were stopping American ships and impressing sailors into British service, and Westerners were nervous that unresolved borders and alliances with native nations could explode at any time. Meanwhile, tensions with revolutionary France were simmering over perceived American favoritism toward Britain. Washington sent Chief Justice John Jay to London with a nearly impossible brief: secure compensation for seized American ships, get the British out of their forts, improve trade access, and somehow avoid being dragged into the European war. The treaty Jay brought back in 1794-95 achieved some of those goals on paper. The British agreed to evacuate certain forts. Commissions were established to resolve debts and claims, and limited commercial arrangements were set up, but it failed to secure firm protections against impressment, offered no sweeping new trade rights with the West Indies, and included clauses that critics saw as bending over backward to accommodate British creditors. When the contents leaked, the public reaction was volcanic. Jay was burned in effigy, town meetings denounced the agreement, and pamphleteers railed that the administration had sold out the Republican cause to the same monarchy whose redcoats had once marched through American streets. Washington, who had hoped the treaty would be received as a painful but necessary compromise to keep the peace and stabilize the economy, instead found himself accused of favoritism, monarchical leanings, and secret Anglophilia, charges that cut deeply against the image of nonpartisan father figure he had tried to maintain. He signed the treaty anyway, calculating that the alternative was a slide into open conflict with the strongest naval power on Earth at a moment when the United States was still fumbling to build even a modest fleet, and time largely vindicated his immediate goal. The treaty did help avert war with Britain in the short term, clarified some lingering issues from the Revolution, and gave American merchants a more predictable, if still constrained, environment in which to operate. But the political cost was enormous. The fight over the Jay Treaty hardened the emerging split between Federalists and Democratic Republicans, energized opposition newspapers, and convinced Washington that his hope of standing above faction was evaporating. His farewell address, with its warnings about entangling alliances and partisan divisions, was written in the long, bitter shadow of that controversy, a reminder that even decisions aimed at preserving peace and stability can carve deep fault lines in a society still deciding what kind of nation it wants to be. 25. When Washington finally decided to step away from the presidency in 1796, he didn't just vanish quietly back to Mount Vernon. He sat down, with help from Alexander Hamilton, but in words that echo his own long anxieties, to compose what became known as the Farewell Address, a document that looks on the surface like a polite retirement announcement, but reads, once you slow down with it, like a worried parent leaving instructions for a house full of teenagers about to throw their first unsupervised party. He warned in calm, almost weary language against permanent, inveterate antipathies and passionate attachments to foreign nations, not because he thought America could float above the world forever, but because he'd watched how European powers used alliances like levers and traps, dragging smaller states into wars that served somebody else's dynasty or balance of power scheme. In his mind, the young republic was too fragile, too easily split, to survive being pulled into somebody else's feud. Just as urgently he aimed his warning inward, at the spirit of party that he had seen harden during the battles over the Jay Treaty and domestic policy, turning honest disagreement into organized faction, where people began to care more about defeating their rivals than about the common good. From his vantage point, parties were not normal features of a healthy democracy but tools that ambitious men could use to inflame regions and interests until citizens forgot they were part of a single nation. The address, printed and reprinted in newspapers rather than delivered as an actual speech, was less a legal directive than a kind of moral weather report, describing dangers he thought were built into human nature and political life. And while later generations would cherry-pick his words to argue for isolationism or against any kind of party politics at all, the heart of his message is simpler and sadder. He believed that entangling foreign commitments and unchecked partisan warfare were twin paths by which the experiment he had helped launch could quietly undo itself from within. 26. When people say Washington refused a third term, it can sound like he turned down a formal crown that someone offered him on a velvet cushion, but the reality was quieter and in some ways more radical. At a moment when many Americans, exhausted by partisan fights and fearful of foreign crises, would probably have accepted him staying in office indefinitely as the one steadying figure everyone knew, he chose to stop after 8 years and walk away from the most powerful job in the country. Under the Constitution, then, there was no legal limit on how many times a president could be elected. The idea of rotation in office was a cultural ideal more than a rule, and the rest of the world's examples, kings who ruled for life, revolutionary leaders who slid into permanent strongmen, suggested that once someone settled into the executive chair, they tended to stay there until death or a coup removed them. Washington had already flirted with something like that temptation after the Revolutionary War, when some officers floated the idea of making him king, or at least allowing him to steer the new government with a heavier hand, and he'd stepped back then. The decision to do essentially the same thing a second time, in a different context, turned personal restraint into a public precedent. By announcing in advance that he would not run again, preparing the farewell address, and then actually leaving when the time came, he made it clear that the presidency was an office borrowed from the people, not a personal possession or lifetime entitlement. And he forced the still young system to prove it could survive the transition from one elected leader to another without collapsing into chaos or civil war. Later presidents from Jefferson onward treated that two-term pattern as a kind of unwritten rule, broken only when Franklin Roosevelt stayed on during the Great Depression and World War II, and it wasn't until the 22nd Amendment in 1951 that Washington's choice hardened into constitutional law. But the cultural weight of that first voluntary exit has always been larger than any statute, a quiet demonstration that the real power in the Republic lay in institutions and consent, not in the sheer charisma or military prestige of one man who could have stayed, and instead decided that part of his duty was knowing when to let go. 27. Before he was the iconic general on the dollar bill, George Washington was a mid-ranking Virginia landowner with more ambition than wealth, a man from the provincial gentry who had some inherited acreage, a modest house, and a reputation for courage, but nothing like the vast fortune people later imagined. And that's where Martha Custis, a petite, twice-widowed mother in her late 20s with 2 surviving children and control over a huge estate, changed the trajectory of his life as thoroughly as any battle ever did. When Washington courted and married her in 1759, he wasn't just gaining a companion. Under Virginia's property laws, he became the manager of the Custis holdings, which included thousands of acres, numerous enslaved people, and complex financial obligations scattered across the colony, instantly catapulting him into a higher tier of wealth and responsibility than he could have reached on his own. That sudden expansion of land and labor allowed him to enlarge and improve Mount Vernon, diversify his agricultural experiments, and step more confidently into the world of colonial politics, where owning extensive property was not just a sign of status, but a prerequisite for voting in certain elections and holding significant offices. The marriage, by most surviving accounts, seems to have been affectionate and cooperative, but it was also very much a strategic alliance in the language of the time. She gained a capable manager and social protector. He gained social connections, financial clout, and a domestic base that could support long absences during the French and Indian War and later the Revolution. At the same time, the Union locked him into the moral and practical web of slavery even more tightly, because a large portion of the people he now oversaw were dower slaves belonging legally to the Custis estate, meaning he controlled their labor but could never free them outright, even if he wished, without complicated negotiations with Martha's children and heirs. That tangle of expanded privilege and constrained power, richer, more influential, but also bound to a system and a family structure he hadn't created, shaped many of the choices he faced for the rest of his life, from how he ran his plantations to the famously careful language of his will, where he freed his own enslaved people but could only express a hope that the Custis enslaved community, brought into his life through marriage, would someday find liberty he was never fully able to give them. 28. For all the later myths that wrapped Washington in a halo of patriarchal destiny, the plain, almost awkward truth is that he and Martha never had biological children together, a fact that puzzled their contemporaries, has invited quiet medical speculation ever since, and shaped their household in ways that rarely make it into grade school stories about the father of his country. Washington had fallen seriously ill with smallpox as a young man in Barbados, and some historians think the fever that scarred his face may also have left him sterile, while others point to bouts of respiratory sickness, possible tuberculosis, or even injuries from his rough frontier life as culprits. Martha, by contrast, had borne 4 children with her first husband, 2 of whom survived to childhood, which suggests that whatever blocked new pregnancies after 1759 likely lay with him rather than her. In a culture that judged women harshly for childlessness and treated fertility as proof of divine favor, the absence of children in their marriage could have been a source of gossip or strain, but there is little sign in surviving letters of open blame or bitterness. What we see instead is a couple who poured parental energy into the 2 Custis children, Patsy and Jackie, and later into a long procession of step-grandchildren, wards, nieces, nephews, and young relatives who cycled through Mount Vernon, filling the place with the noise and worry of a family that was always partial, borrowed, or temporary. The lack of a direct heir also cast a long, invisible shadow over Washington's public life, because unlike many European leaders of his day, he had no son to install in office, no dynastic claim to quietly prepare. When he stepped down from the army, and later from the presidency, the very fact that he had no biological child waiting in the wings made his renunciations feel cleaner, more believable as acts of Republican principle rather than clever maneuvers to protect a family line. At the same time, that childlessness meant his private hopes for the future had to be invested in institutions and in the broader younger generation rather than in one boy bearing his name, which may help explain why he worried so intensely about how fragile the experiment was and how easily faction or foreign intrigue could poison what he had, in a literal sense, no blood descendant to inherit. 29. If you imagine Mount Vernon as a quiet country retreat, where George and Martha shuffled around in dignified solitude, the reality of their household life would probably feel closer to a small, constantly humming village than to a postcard of pastoral calm. A complex, layered domestic world where relatives, visitors, paid workers, hired overseers, and a large enslaved community lived, labored, clashed, and cooperated under the same loose authority of one man whose name history remembers and hundreds of people whose names were mostly never written down. The family at Mount Vernon in Washington's time was not just George and Martha and the occasional stepchild, but also step-grandchildren they effectively adopted, orphaned nieces and nephews sent there for education or discipline, traveling dignitaries, curious neighbors, foreign officers, and political petitioners who treated his home like a halfway house between plantation and public office, dropping in for days or weeks, eating at his table, and adding to the constant churn of conversation and obligation that never quite let the place rest. Under and around that swirl of genteel social life, hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children, some owned outright by Washington, many others dour enslaved people tied to the Custis estate, did the daily invisible work that kept the operation running, cooking for crowds that might double without warning, laundering fine linens, tending horses in gardens, building fences, repairing tools, nursing sick neighbors, rowing guests across the Potomac, all under a system of surveillance and punishment that Washington tried to regulate with written rules and account books, but that, in practice, meant human beings navigating the thin, dangerous space between his expectations and their own desperate need for small pockets of autonomy. Add to that the presence of hired white craftsmen, tenants on outlying farms, visiting preachers, traveling peddlers, and the occasional runaway returning under duress, and Mount Vernon begins to look less like a single household and more like a crossroads where different classes, races, and legal statuses rubbed up against each other every day, creating a dense web of gossip, alliances, resentments, and negotiations. Washington, who loved order and schedules, tried to impose structure on this world with meticulous ledgers, rotating work assignments, detailed menus, and rules about when guests should appear at table or when enslaved workers should receive rations. But even his disciplined handwriting reveals how often he had to adjust on the fly, making room for unexpected visitors, dealing with thefts or attempted escapes, shifting people between farms, or responding to illnesses that could rip through crowded quarters. In that sense, the great man who later symbolized a clean, abstract ideal of national unity spent much of his private life as something more mundane and more human, a manager of a sprawling, messy, deeply unequal community where every decision about who slept where, who worked which field, or who got a rare day off had moral weight. He often tried not to look at too closely. 30. When Washington first came into possession of Mount Vernon as a young man, the house was still a modest, somewhat awkwardly proportioned structure perched above the Potomac, comfortable enough by local standards, but a far cry from the symmetrical, commanding mansion people tour today. And over the next 4 decades, he treated it less like a finished home than like an ongoing architectural argument with himself about status, function, and what it meant to craft a landscape that advertised both refinement and control. He expanded the central house in 2 major building campaigns, lengthening the wings, raising the roofline, and adding features like the cupola and the long colonnaded piazza that runs along the riverside, all meant to give the impression of a carefully planned Georgian estate, even though much of it grew in stages, attached to older walls and rooms that had to be repurposed as his family, guest list, and ambitions swelled. At the same time, he reimagined the surrounding grounds with an eye for both beauty and efficiency, rerouting roads so visitors would approach through a deliberately framed vista, planting groves of trees to soften the geometry, laying out kitchen gardens and orchards in neat patterns, and scattering outbuildings, dairies, smokehouses, spinning houses, slave quarters, a blacksmith shop in ways that kept the smells and noise of labor somewhat out of elite sight, while keeping everything close, enough for supervision. Beneath that aesthetic layer, Mount Vernon was always first and foremost a working plantation, and Washington's redesign supported his shifting agricultural experiments. When he moved from tobacco to a more diversified system built around wheat, corn, and livestock, he built new barns and mills, introduced crop rotations across his 5 separate farms, and tinkered endlessly with tools, plow designs, and storage methods, treating the entire estate as a laboratory whose success depended on the coerced labor of the people he owned. Even while serving in the Revolution and the presidency, he sent home detailed instructions on fence lines, new building techniques, and the placement of windows, obsessed with getting both airflow and visual symmetry right, a reminder that the man portrayed as a distant marble figure was also, in daily practice, a hands-on project manager who cared whether a hinge sagged or a field gate aligned with a lane. By the time he died, Mount Vernon had become a physical autobiography written in wood, brick, and carefully graded slopes, a place where the gracious hospitality visiting Europeans marveled at sat directly atop warehouses, workshops, and crowded quarters that made the performance possible, embodying in one concentrated landscape both a Republican polish and the enslaved backbone of the world he helped to build. 31. for all the grand portraits that show Washington in uniform or seated in a polished chair. One of the most revealing versions of him exists not on a battlefield or in a stateroom, but out in the fields around Mount Vernon, where he slowly, stubbornly unlearned the old Virginia habit of mining the soil with endless tobacco and replaced it with something more experimental, data-driven, and frankly unglamorous: crop rotations, fallow fields, manure management, imported seeds, and careful notes on what actually grew instead of what tradition said ought to grow. When he inherited and then expanded Mount Vernon, much of the land had already been exhausted by generations of tobacco culture that stripped nutrients and left gullied, eroding slopes, and Washington, who needed cash, like every other planter, could easily have doubled down on the crop that brought quick money at the cost of long-term ruin. Instead, over the 1760s and 1770s, he began shifting the estate toward wheat as a primary cash crop, with corn, oats, peas, clover, and grasses woven into a deliberate sequence that allowed fields to rest and recover, a practice that required him to think in multi-year cycles rather than single-season profit. He ordered and read British and European agricultural treatises, scribbled marginalia, sent away for improved plow designs, and wrote long, sometimes cranky letters to his farm managers about why a particular field had not been sown to clover, or why manure heaps had been allowed to sit unused, instead of being spread where they might restore tired ground. Under his plan, Mount Vernon's 5 distinct farms, Mansion House, Dogue Run, Muddy Hole, Union Farm, and River Farm, were each slotted into a rotation system whose complexity would have made little sense to neighboring planters still fixated on tobacco, but which let him integrate grazing animals, grain crops, and soil-building plants into a kind of living machine. The irony is that these innovations, which later agricultural reformers praised as enlightened, were carried out through the coerced labor of hundreds of enslaved people who dug the ditches, hauled the muck, planted the clover, and shifted herds from one enclosure to another, turning Washington's notebook diagrams into reality, while having no say in the grand experiment that governed the rhythm of their days. 32. Washington's obsession with improving his lands did not stop at plants and plows. It extended to hooves and bloodlines, and nowhere did that fixation show more clearly than in his almost evangelical enthusiasm for mules, those hybrid offspring of a male donkey and a female horse that he became convinced were the future of American agriculture. In the 1780s, when most Virginia planters still relied on horses and oxen to pull plows and wagons, mules were relatively rare in the colonies, prized in parts of Europe and the Mediterranean for their strength, stamina, and tough hooves, but not yet widely bred or understood in the new United States. Washington, always alert for anything that might save labor and protect his increasingly carefully managed fields, wanted them in numbers, and his chance came through transatlantic diplomacy. The King of Spain, who tightly controlled the export of the prized Andalusian donkeys used to sire the best mules, agreed to send Washington a high-quality jack nicknamed Royal Gift, along with another from the Spanish viceroy in the West Indies. These animals were not just curiosities, they were strategic assets in Washington's mind, and he set about pairing them with suitable mares at Mount Vernon and encouraging friends, neighbors, and even political acquaintances to do the same, effectively turning his plantation into a breeding hub for what he believed could be a quiet revolution in American draft power. In letters, he sounded almost like a salesman touting how mules ate less than horses, lived longer, and were less likely to injure themselves in the rough, rutted roads and unrefined fields of the young republic, arguing that the initial cost of breeding would repay itself many times over in reduced wear on soil and equipment. Over time, his herd grew into dozens of animals, and accounts from visitors describe fields where sleek, long-eared teams pulled plows and wagons with a steady, unfussy pace that pleased the owner who watched his theories about efficiency come to life. Just like his crop rotations, Washington's mule project has often been wrapped in a folksy image of a practical farmer tinkering with livestock, but underneath that pastoral gloss was the same matrix of power: enslaved grooms feeding, grooming, and training the animals, enslaved drivers guiding them through furrows and along roads, and an owner who translated their daily sweaty work into tidy statistics about output and improvement in letters that circulated among the elite as evidence of American ingenuity. 33. For all his talk of industry and improvement, Washington also carved out a private world of ritualized leisure that revolved around animals in a very different way. Through the breeding of sleek foxhounds and the carefully choreographed chaos of the hunt, a pastime that let him step out of the roles of general and statesman and back into the older identity of a Virginia country gentleman, leading the chase across fields and woodlots he had spent years shaping. From his younger days well into middle age, he maintained detailed records of his dogs' lineages, temperaments, and performance, giving them names that mixed classical references, affectionate nicknames, and the occasional wry joke, and he swapped breeding stock with other enthusiasts, the way politicians later traded patronage, always in search of a pack that combined speed, nose, and discipline. Early on, his hounds were largely of English stock, imported or descended from imported animals, but in the 1780s the Marquis de Lafayette sent him a gift of French hounds, taller, deeper-voiced, sometimes wilder, which Washington crossed into his existing pack, experimenting with combinations as carefully as he did with grain rotations, even noting which pairings produced dogs too unruly for his taste. On mornings when a hunt was planned, the man who elsewhere comes down to us as a marble figure stood in boots and riding coat, surrounded by baying hounds whose behavior he knew individually, ready to spend hours galloping after a fox across his own farms and sometimes over neighbors' lands, following a set of social rules and unspoken hierarchies that made the hunt as much about status and camaraderie as about sport. Visitors and relatives remembered how animated he became on these outings, how quick he was to praise a good run or a clever hound, and how the man who could be stiff and formal at a state dinner relaxed into an easy, earthy humor among dogs and fellow riders. Yet even this seemingly carefree pastime rested on the same foundation as everything else at Mount Vernon: enslaved hunters to help manage the packs, enslaved workers to repair fences and maintain the landscape that made the chase possible, enslaved stable hands to ready horses and clean up afterward. In that sense, Washington's world of dog breeding and fox hunting reveals another layer of the hidden truth behind the national myth: the founding father as meticulous hobbyist and avid sportsman, whose most cherished recreations, like his most serious enterprises, were inseparable from a plantation system that turned other people's unchosen labor into the backdrop for his chosen pleasures. 34. For someone who spent so much of his public life trying to say as little as possible in speeches and formal proclamations, Washington poured an almost obsessive amount of language into the one audience he could control completely: his own ledgers and diaries, which he kept year after year in a tight, compact hand that moved across the page with more discipline than flourish, recording not what he felt about events in high rhetoric so much as what actually happened on his land and in his household on any given day. Open one of those volumes and you don't find heroic phrases about liberty. You find lines like "morning clear, wind at NE, ground much frozen," followed by notes on which fields were plowed, which carpenters showed up for work, which guests arrived unexpectedly and how long they stayed, what was planted, what was harvested, what tools broke, which enslaved workers were hired out or punished or married, and how much fish came out of the Potomac that week. He logged arrivals and departures, transactions and illnesses, births and deaths, stitching weather, labor and hospitality into a single relentless account book of his world, so detailed that historians now use it like a time-lapse film of an 18th century estate's daily metabolism. The image of Washington that emerges from those pages is not a marble statue at all, but an almost bureaucratic mind trying to pin down a chaotic reality with categories and numbers. He recorded the exact quantity of nails purchased for a building project, the yield of wheat from a particular field, the dates of frosts, the names of visiting diplomats and obscure cousins with equal care, as if everything from a new plow design to a passing thunderstorm might matter in the long run. It is tempting to read the sheer density of these entries as evidence of cold detachment, but there are flickers of something more personal: brief mentions of illness, worry over his stepchildren, irritation at incompetent overseers, buried so quickly under the next list of hogs slaughtered or guests entertained that you can almost watch him pushing feeling back into the margins, choosing instead to manage what he can, the data points of his life. The irony is that this relentless record-keeping, meant at first to help him track farming decisions and household flows, ended up preserving the precise contours of the world he controlled, including the movements and labor of hundreds of enslaved people who left very few written traces of their own, so that his private attempt at order also became one of the clearest surviving maps of the plantation system he spent his life benefiting from. 35. Those diaries were only one part of a much larger paper universe Washington built around himself, a universe in which letters flowed in and out of Mount Vernon and wartime headquarters like tides, and in which he grew steadily more aware that the words he wrote today might become the documents someone else used tomorrow to explain who he had been. From early adulthood, he kept copies of his outgoing letters whenever he could, painstakingly drafting in a neat hand, revising phrases, and sometimes recopying important correspondence into special letter books, not simply because he wanted a record of business dealings or military orders, but because he seemed to understand that written words outlived their makers and could be stitched into whatever story the future wanted to tell. Over time, as the boy surveyor turned into a famous general and then into the first president of the United States, that instinct hardened into a kind of curatorial habit. He sorted, preserved, and sometimes carefully weeded his correspondence, deciding which moments of doubt or anger would survive on paper and which would vanish in the flames of a hearth. He asked trusted aides to organize his papers. He directed that certain documents be copied and circulated while others stayed tightly controlled. He answered flattering requests for his views with letters that balanced genuine opinion against a clear awareness that every line might someday be quoted as Washington's judgment on this or that issue. When he drafted his circular letter to the states at the end of the Revolutionary War, or his farewell to the American people at the close of his presidency, he workshopped the language with close confidants, smoothing the edges, removing pettiness, leaning into themes of unity, moderation, and Republican virtue in ways that sounded like advice to contemporaries, but also read like instructions to posterity about how to interpret his career. Even his more mundane letters, complaining about late payments from Congress, quibbling with French officers, or grumbling about the quality of flour at Mount Vernon, were kept in bundles, labeled and stored, as if he knew that someday someone would comb through them looking for the real Washington, and he wanted, as much as any human could, to be the one arranging the exhibits. That does not mean he orchestrated every scrap. Plenty of candid, unflattering moments survived his control. But compared to many of his peers, he left behind a remarkably continuous, self-assembled archive that has allowed biographers to build a Washington who speaks in long, connected paragraphs rather than scattered fragments, an outcome owed as much to his quiet, clerical sense of preservation as to any grand speech he ever gave in public. 36. Behind all that careful writing and record-keeping, and behind the famously stiff posture in paintings and presidential receptions, ran a deeper current that people around him recognized immediately, an almost old-world fixation on honor, reputation, and what his choices would look like when judged by others, whether those others were his fellow officers, his political rivals, or a public he would never meet. From his youth as a provincial officer in the French and Indian War, when he bristled at slights from British generals and agonized over how his conduct would be seen in London, to his later years as commander-in-chief, he consistently framed decisions in terms of dignity and character, sometimes delaying or complicating practical moves because he worried that a misstep would stain not just his name but the cause he had come to embody. This sensitivity could make him cautious to the point of frustration for more impulsive colleagues. He fretted about the optics of retreating from New York, about how harshly to treat mutineers, about whether accepting a salary from Congress would look self-interested, but it also drove some of his most consequential choices, like surrendering his commission to Congress at the end of the war rather than clinging to military power, an act he knew would resonate as a statement that the army served the Republic, not the other way around. As president, he staged his public appearances with almost theatrical care, riding in a carriage sometimes criticized as too regal, holding formal levees at set times, refusing to be seen drinking heavily or behaving casually in ways that might undercut the gravity he thought the office needed, all while privately acknowledging in letters that he dreaded accusations of monarchical ambition. He declined a third term, not just from exhaustion, but from a sense that staying longer would set a dangerous precedent and tarnish the ideal of Republican rotation in office, and he spent significant energy crafting his farewell address as both a defense of his conduct and a manual for how a future, more anonymous president ought to behave. This constant attention to how things looked could slide into vanity. He cared about portraits, about uniforms, about the social pecking order at dinners, and yet it also bound him, at crucial moments, to a standard beyond personal comfort, pushing him to absorb criticism rather than lash out publicly, to maintain outward composure when he was seething inside, to retire when he might have preferred to remain the indispensable man. In that sense, the marble Washington of legend, always composed and above the fray, was partly a costume he designed and wore with full awareness of its political power, a role that cost him intimacy and spontaneity, but gave him what he valued more than almost anything else. The feeling that when the story was finally told, his name would stand for a certain kind of public virtue, however compromised the private reality beneath it might have been. 37. For people who only met him in drawing rooms, at levees, or in the stiff public rituals of the presidency, Washington could come across as almost painfully formal, a man wrapped in silence and ceremony who seemed more like a carved figurehead than a neighbor, and that impression wasn't just shyness or temperament, it was something he cultivated on purpose, because he decided that the new office he occupied needed a kind of distant dignity if the republic was going to survive its infancy. He limited the number of people who could approach him, held visiting hours like a European monarch, and answered certain conversations with polite, non-committal phrases that revealed almost nothing of what he actually thought, not because he had no opinions, but because he believed a president who joked too freely or bared too many private feelings would cheapen the role and drag the institution down to the level of ordinary party wrangling. Friends and relatives sometimes complained that the man who had once laughed in camp or shared stories around a wartime fire seemed to have hardened into a public statue, but in letters he admitted that he was playing a part, weighing every word and gesture for how it would look in the newspapers and in the memories of people not yet born. And once you understand that, his distance feels less like coldness and more like a deliberate sacrifice of spontaneity in exchange for a kind of national theater in which his own comfort mattered less than the image he thought the country needed to see. 38. That image was reinforced by something you can't miss in any of the surviving descriptions of him. Even before the revolution made his name famous, he was big, not in the exaggerated Paul Bunyan way that later storytellers like to imagine, but in a very real, very obvious physical sense that made him stand out in a crowd where most men were several inches shorter and far less imposing than a broad-shouldered Virginian who stood somewhere around 6'2" and carried himself like someone used to the weight of other people's expectations. Contemporaries talked about his height, his long arms, the way he sat a horse, so naturally that even hostile observers grudgingly admitted he looked like a commander before he opened his mouth. And that presence did some of the political work for him, making it easier for people to project authority and steadiness onto a man who often spoke less than his more flamboyant peers. In battle, soldiers said they could pick him out instantly as he rode along the lines, and in Philadelphia, foreign diplomats remarked that his mere entrance into a room seemed to change its temperature, as if the air grew more formal because his posture and measured movements told everyone, without words, that they were in the company of someone who took both himself and his responsibilities seriously. It's tempting to brush that off as superficial, but in an age without mass media, where most citizens would never read a detailed speech or see a realistic portrait, the physical fact of Washington's body, tall, upright, carefully dressed, visibly in control of his temper, became one of the most persuasive arguments that the fragile experiment of a president, rather than a king, could look impressive enough to command obedience without velvet crowns or jeweled scepters. 39. Beneath that commanding exterior, though the body doing all this symbolic work was never as indestructible as the painting suggests, and if you trace his life from the fevers of his youth to the agonizing throat infection that killed him, you find a man who moved through adulthood with a constant, mostly hidden awareness that illness could sweep everything away in a matter of days. He survived smallpox as a teenager, emerged scarred but immune enough to turn that personal misfortune into a strategic advantage when he later ordered inoculations for Continental troops, and spent decades wrestling with bouts of malaria-like chills, dysentery, tooth decay so severe that he ended up with false teeth, and the kind of chronic pain that 18th century medicine answered with bloodletting, blistering, mercury, and purgatives that often made the cure worse than the disease. Visitors at Mount Vernon sometimes noticed him absent from meals or quieter than usual, without understanding that he was nursing headaches, stomach troubles, or a lingering cough, and he rarely dramatized these problems in public, partly out of pride and partly because he believed that a leader who complained openly about his own body would weaken the morale of people depending on him. When his final illness struck in December 1799, a sudden inflammation of the throat that left him struggling for breath, his doctors bled him repeatedly and applied treatments that modern observers wince at, yet he submitted with the same fatalistic discipline he had shown on battlefields, even taking time between gasps to give instructions about his estate and to insist that his burial be delayed to avoid any chance of premature interment. The paradox is that the man Americans learned to think of as a symbol of almost superhuman vigor was, In private, a patient who endured pain, harsh remedies, and the constant risk that some new fever would end his carefully built life, and instead of undermining his legend, that vulnerability ends up making his calm public face more eerie, a mask of health and steadiness held in place by sheer will over a body that knew, long before anyone carved him in marble, that it was always one infection away from disappearing. 40. Long before he put on the formal black suit and powdered hair that Americans now picture when they imagine President Washington, he was carrying around a quieter, more intimate misery that rarely makes it into the heroic portraits. His mouth hurt almost all the time, and that slow, grinding pain shaped the way he looked, spoke, and even how much he chose to say in rooms where other politicians loved to dominate the conversation. From his early 30s onward, his teeth began to rot, loosen, and fall out, a process driven by genetics, disease, and the rough dentistry of the era, more than by any one bad habit, until he was constantly dealing with infections, swollen gums, and the embarrassment of trying to chew at public dinners without showing how difficult the simplest bite of food had become. The famous false teeth that replaced them were not wooden, despite the schoolbook myth, but an unsettling combination of animal teeth, human teeth, metal springs, and carved ivory that pinched his gums, altered the shape of his jawline, and gave his mouth that slightly tense, closed appearance you can see if you study the best surviving portraits. Those contraptions were heavy and uncomfortable. They made it hard for him to smile broadly. They subtly distorted his speech, and they likely contributed to the impression of stiffness and reserve that visitors later mistook for pure temperament, rather than a man trying to keep an ill-fitting set of jaws from shifting while he listened to senators argue in front of him. In private letters, he fretted about dental bills, begged for new fittings, and worried that the constant discomfort would embarrass him when he had to receive foreign dignitaries, a reminder that even as the young republic projected strength through his tall, commanding figure, the man at its center was privately managing a very human fear of appearing ridiculous whenever he opened his mouth to speak. 41. That concern with appearances becomes even more complicated when you remember what lay outside the elegant dining rooms where he tried not to let his dentures slip, because the estate that paid for his dentists, his clothes, and the carefully curated public image of Republican virtue was built, in the most literal, daily sense, on the unpaid labor of hundreds of enslaved men, women, and children whose names usually don't get mentioned when we talk about the father of his country. At Mount Vernon, the polished house on the hill depended on a sprawling, carefully organized network of fields, workshops, kitchens, and outbuildings where enslaved workers planted, harvested, cooked, cleaned, built, mended, and tended livestock from dawn past dark, generating the tobacco, wheat, and other products that allowed Washington to entertain guests lavishly while appearing above the grubby details of money. He tracked these people in ledgers, bought and sold some of them, separated families when he thought the farm needed rebalancing, and used a mixture of punishments, rewards, and surveillance to keep the system running, even as he occasionally grumbled in letters about the costs of clothing and feeding the human beings whose forced labor made his gentlemanly lifestyle possible. During his presidency in Philadelphia, where state law offered a path to freedom for enslaved people who lived there long enough, he quietly rotated those he brought from Virginia out of the city before they could claim that right, a deliberate maneuver that shows how seriously he took both his legal property rights and the social expectation that a man of his class should appear prosperous and in control. When guests marveled at Mount Vernon's orderly farms and complimented his managerial genius, they were, often without saying so, praising a system that reduced people to tools, a central, unresolved contradiction that runs straight through his life. A leader who talked about liberty and Republican virtue while sleeping in a house whose foundations were quite literally laid by hands he owned. 42. That contradiction never entirely left him. And if you follow his private correspondence across the decades, from the ambitious young officer eager to acquire more land and labor to the older statesman watching the country fracture along regional lines, you see something shift, slowly and unevenly, in the way he wrote about slavery, even if that evolution stayed mostly behind closed doors and rarely erupted into the kind of public crusade later generations might wish for. Early on, he accepted the institution as a given part of Virginia life, investing in enslaved workers the way his peers did and worrying more about crop yields and discipline than about the morality of the system. But exposure to northern states where slavery was being phased out, along with the ideals that animated the revolution, left him increasingly uneasy about what it meant for a nation founded on natural rights to keep millions of people in chains. In private, He began to talk about slavery as something he hoped would eventually end through gradual, orderly measures rather than sudden upheaval, and he worried that the growing split between slaveholding and free states could tear the fragile union apart if the issue were forced too quickly or violently into the center of national politics. He supported measures like banning the international slave trade and made cautious statements about the justice of eventual abolition, all while continuing to benefit from enslaved labor at Mount Vernon, a gap between belief and action that makes his story less simple than either hagiography or outright condemnation. In the end, the most radical step he took was not a public speech but a legal document. In his will, he arranged for the people he personally owned to be freed after Martha's death, and provided for the education and support of the young among them, an unusually sweeping move for a Virginia planter of his generation, but one that left untouched the many individuals at Mount Vernon owned through Martha's family line. That mixture of moral discomfort, political caution, limited private action, and public silence doesn't resolve neatly into hero or villain. Instead, it leaves us with a man who could sense that the institution sustaining his world was dangerous and wrong, yet moved against it only in the safest, most controlled ways, leaving the explosive consequences to future generations who would no longer be able to treat the problem as something that could be postponed until after a good night's sleep. 43. In that final will, written when the war was over and the republic he'd helped build was staggering into an uncertain adulthood, Washington did something that quietly broke with most of his fellow Virginia planters. He ordered that every enslaved person he legally owned in his own name be freed, not immediately but after Martha's death, and he attached to that emancipation a series of instructions that read less like a simple property transfer and more like a guilty conscience trying, a little late, to think through what freedom would actually mean for people whose entire lives had been controlled by his decisions. He directed that the elderly and infirm be supported out of his estate for the rest of their lives, that the young be taught to read, write, and learn a trade so they could support themselves, and that families not be broken up in the process, a level of detail that suggests he understood, at least in outline, how cruelly the system he had participated in treated human beings as interchangeable assets. At the same time, he made sure the emancipation would not really take effect until he himself was safely beyond the reach of social backlash and financial inconvenience, tying the freedom of those people to Martha's lifespan, a delay that protected her comfort and the estate's smooth operation at the cost of years of continued bondage for the very individuals he claimed to be relieving. When news of the will slowly circulated, some contemporaries praised his foresight and benevolence, others quietly resented the precedent, and still others, especially those already skeptical of slavery, saw it as too little and too cautious, a gesture that confirmed he knew the institution was wrong while also underscoring how rarely men of his class were willing to sacrifice anything substantial to end it in their own lifetimes. For the people at Mount Vernon whom he actually owned, though the document was not a philosophical statement but a clock silently installed over their heads, counting down, year by uncertain year, to a promised freedom that depended entirely on outliving the woman who still held the power to order their work, their punishments, and the shape of each passing day. 44. The catch, and it is a big one that history textbooks often skim past with a single polite sentence, is that Washington did not, and legally could not, own everyone whose labor made Mount Vernon run. Many of the men, women, and children who lived and worked there were what Virginia law called dour slaves, human property technically belonging to the Custis estate through Martha's first marriage, which meant that in the cold arithmetic of inheritance law, they were assets meant to be divided among her children and grandchildren, not people that George could unilaterally decide to free, no matter what his private conscience was starting to whisper. When you step back and imagine the plantation as they would have known it, this legal hair-splitting creates a surreal kind of inequality. Some families included members Washington owned outright and could liberate in his will, living alongside spouses or children tied, on paper, to the Custis line and thus destined to remain enslaved unless Martha's heirs, scattered across their own properties and interests, someday chose differently. This meant that the emancipation clauses in his will, however unusual for a man of his position, landed like a jagged blade right through the middle of the slave quarters, promising freedom to some while implicitly condemning others to continued bondage, not because of anything they had done, but because of who had signed the purchase documents decades earlier. Martha, by all accounts, felt uneasy living in a house where dozens of people now knew that their freedom would come automatically when she died, and there are hints in letters and recollections that she feared for her safety, or at least dreaded the strange tension of being the single living obstacle between people and liberty. Within about a year of Washington's death, she quietly signed a deed that freed the people her husband had owned immediately, rather than waiting for her own passing, a decision that may have been driven as much by self-preservation and discomfort as by any moral awakening, but that still left the dour slaves in the same limbo they had always occupied. So when we talk about Washington as the founder who freed his enslaved workers, it helps to remember that the legal and family tangle meant his gesture could never be clean or complete. He chipped at the edges of a system that claimed ownership over human beings through marriage contracts and estate law, but he never publicly challenged those rules, and the result was a patchwork of freedom and captivity that would keep echoing through Mount Vernon's enslaved families long after both George and Martha were gone, 45. For at least one woman, whose life intersected with Washington's in a far more intimate way than most plantation ledgers can show, waiting around for a will or an estate lawyer was never going to be enough, and her story gives that elegant image of the presidential household a jarring, necessary crack. Oney Judge, sometimes recorded as Ona, was an enslaved woman of mixed black and white ancestry who served as Martha Washington's personal maid, dressing the First Lady, traveling with the family. From Mount Vernon to the presidential residences in New York and Philadelphia, and living inside the very rooms where the new nation's elite congratulated themselves on their love of liberty. Because Pennsylvania had a gradual abolition law that could allow enslaved people to claim freedom after a certain period of continuous residence, Washington quietly rotated his enslaved servants back to Virginia before they reached that deadline, a legal sidestep designed to keep people like Oney permanently in bondage without ever having to test the boundaries of the state law in court. In 1796, after hearing that she was to be given as a kind of living wedding gift to Martha's granddaughter, a transfer that would have bound her to a new owner, and probably moved her far from the limited networks and relative autonomy she had built, Oney decided she would rather risk everything than be handed over like furniture, and she slipped away from the Philadelphia household with the help of free black acquaintances, eventually making her way to Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Washington, informed of her escape, did not shrug and let her go. He authorized quiet efforts to recover her, sending letters that tried to frame his pursuit as a matter of rightful property rather than cruelty, while Oney, interviewed years later, recalled refusing an offer to return under a promise of easy treatment, because she knew that any so-called leniency could be revoked the moment she set foot back under their roof. She chose a precarious life in the North, technically still at risk of recapture under the laws of the time, over the relative physical comfort of the presidential mansion, and in that choice you can see, far more clearly than in any statue, what Washington's ownership of human beings felt like from the other side, not the abstract peculiar institution of political debate, but a daily suffocating control strong enough that a young woman would rather flee into an unfamiliar city with no legal protections than stay in the orbit of the most powerful couple in the country. Oney Judge lived out her days in New England, poor and often struggling but steadfast in her decision, telling interviewers in her old age that she never regretted running, because no kindness from a master, not even a president, could ever compensate for the basic fact of being owned. 46. The detail that often gets flattened into a footnote about legal complexity has an uglier, more deliberate edge when you look closely, because Washington didn't just happen to have enslaved people in a state that was slowly abolishing slavery. He and his advisors studied Pennsylvania's gradual emancipation law, noted the 6-month residency rule that could allow someone like Oney Judge or Hercules the cook to claim their freedom, and then built a rotating system around it, quietly sending enslaved workers back to Virginia just before the clock ran out, and replacing them with others, so no one ever stayed long enough to test the law in court. Letters between Washington and his secretary make it clear this wasn't an accident of travel schedules but a conscious strategy, and you can feel him trying to walk an impossible line. He wanted to maintain the public image of a Republican gentleman who respected local laws, while privately instructing that the comings and goings of his enslaved household be managed in a way that kept those same laws from ever granting them rights. To Pennsylvania neighbors and foreign diplomats, the presidential mansion looked like a model of enlightened domestic order. Inside that elegant choreography, however, was a ticking calendar known to the Washingtons and their staff, in which human beings were treated like pieces on a board that had to be moved across state lines on schedule to prevent them from crossing an invisible legal threshold into personhood. When modern interpreters talk about him as being troubled by slavery, This is one of the sharpest counterpoints. A man capable of understanding legal nuance well enough to dodge an emancipation statute for years, deciding, again and again, to protect his ownership interests rather than allow the revolutionary rhetoric swirling around him in Philadelphia to attach itself to the people who dressed him, cooked his meals, and stood silently in the background of state dinners. 47. If you grew up with portraits of Washington kneeling in the snow at Valley Forge, head bowed in perfect Christian humility, it can be jarring to learn that his actual religious life, as far as we can reconstruct it, refuses to fit neatly into any of the tidy labels later generations try to put on it, and that the people who study him most closely still disagree, sometimes sharply, about what he really believed. On paper, he was an Anglican turned Episcopalian, serving as a vestryman, attending services regularly when travel and war allowed, and sprinkling his public pronouncements with references to Providence and the great author in ways that sound, to modern ears, like generic 18th century Christianity. But when you look at his private habits, the picture blurs. He almost never mentioned Jesus Christ by name in correspondence. He often slipped out of church before communion, and his own pastor in Philadelphia later wrote that Washington consistently declined to take the sacrament, even when gently pressed. Some historians see in this a classic Enlightenment deist, convinced that a distant creator set the universe in motion but skeptical of specific doctrines and miracles. Others argue that reticence and a sense of decorum, not doubt, kept him from speaking more personally about faith, pointing to days of fasting he proclaimed, and the biblical language in his circulars to the army as signs of a more conventional belief. The record is thin enough that almost any confident claim says more about the interpreter than about Washington, and maybe that's the most telling thing. The first president has become a kind of religious mirror in which devout Christians, secularists, and everyone in between can find just enough scattered evidence to imagine that the father of his country quietly agreed with them, while the man himself left behind carefully vague phrases and a lifetime of polite church-going that reveal almost nothing about what, in the sleepless hours between decisions, he actually thought would happen to him when he died. 48. If his real religious views are foggy, one thing about his moral image is crystal clear. One of the most famous stories ever told about George Washington, the earnest little boy who could not tell a lie and bravely confessed to chopping down his father's cherry tree, is pure invention, dreamed up decades after his death by a writer who thought the new republic needed an easily digestible hero more than it needed historical accuracy. The tale first appeared in 1806 in a biography by Mason Locke Weems, an itinerant preacher and bookseller who understood marketing as well as any modern influencer. He wanted to sell a vision of Washington not just as a successful general and president, but as a perfect moral example for children. So he filled in the blank spaces of the first president's childhood with parables that read less like memory and more like Sunday school lessons with powdered wigs. There are no contemporary references to the cherry tree episode, no family letters marveling at young George's honesty in the orchard, just Weems's anonymous aged lady source, and a narrative that conveniently hits every virtue 19th century Americans wanted to see in their founding idol: truthfulness, respect for property, and a kind of gentle paternal forgiveness that makes the father's reaction as important as the boy's confession. For generations, textbooks and school primers repeated the story as if it were fact, helping to cement an image of Washington as the embodiment of simple homespun virtue, an image so powerful that even as professional historians debunked it, the phrase "I cannot tell a lie" stuck in the cultural lexicon. Lying awake and tracing that legend backward, you can almost feel how badly a young nation, unstable and uncertain, wanted its first president to be less a complicated human being, soldier, slaveholder, cautious politician, and more a sort of secular saint, someone whose childhood supposedly proved that the republic itself had been built on an unshakable foundation of honesty, even if the real history underneath was already full of compromise, secrecy, and half-truths. 49. When the end finally came for Washington, it didn't arrive on a battlefield or in some grand cinematic moment of state, but in the middle of a cold Virginia December, after he'd spent a long day out on horseback inspecting his plantation in sleet and snow, refusing to change his wet clothes because guests were waiting for dinner, a mix of stubbornness and courtesy that would turn out to be fatal. That night he developed a sore throat, the kind of thing that in a modern setting would probably mean lozenges and a doctor's visit, but by the early hours of the next morning, his airway was swelling, his voice growing faint, And the best medicine the late 18th century could offer was about to make things worse in ways that are hard to listen to, even from the safety of centuries later. 3 different physicians were summoned to Mount Vernon, and over the course of roughly 12 hours they followed the standard medical wisdom of their time, opening his veins repeatedly and draining an estimated 40% of his blood, blistering his throat with irritants, dosing him with calomel and tartar emetic to purge his system, and even trying to induce vomiting in a man who was already struggling to draw breath. Some modern doctors who have reconstructed the case think he probably had acute epiglottitis or a severe bacterial infection that was closing his airway, something that might today be treated with antibiotics, steroids, and an emergency tracheotomy. But in 1799, the same Enlightenment world that had produced constitutions and republics still trusted humoral theory, the idea that you balance the body by taking things out of it. Witnesses said Washington stayed calm through all of this, apologizing to the people around his bed for the trouble he was causing, insisting on sitting upright as long as he could, and eventually, when it became clear even to the men bleeding him that nothing more could be done, asking them to make sure his accounts were settled and his papers in order. Shortly before 10 at night, after telling those present that he was not afraid to go and asking to be decently buried, he died, likely from a combination of the underlying infection and the shock and fluid loss from aggressive bloodletting, a death that almost reads like a parable about a man trapped between 2 worlds, medically between medieval practices and modern science, and symbolically between the age of kings he'd helped overthrow and the uncertain experimental republic he was leaving behind. 50. For all the messy human details that complicate his life, one thing most historians agree on is that Washington thought constantly about what his actions would mean for whoever came after him, treating the presidency not as a personal throne to be enjoyed, but as a fragile experiment whose survival depended on the habits, limits, and rituals he attached to it in real time. He could have leaned hard into the adoration that followed the revolution, letting His Excellency slide into something closer to a hereditary monarch, but instead he pushed for the simple Mr. President, refused proposals for elaborate robes and a gilded coach, and held those oddly stilted levees, formal receptions where citizens could approach him, precisely to signal that the head of state was accessible, but not a celebrity to be mobbed in the street. When the Senate tried to claim a role in removing executive officers, he insisted that the power to fire cabinet members belonged to the president alone, a decision that quietly defined the modern executive branch. And when the Whiskey Rebellion flared in western Pennsylvania, he personally rode out at the head of a militia force to enforce federal law, then pardoned the ringleaders, drawing a line between the government's right to assert authority and its obligation not to crush dissent with needless brutality. Most consequential of all, he stepped down after 2 terms, even though virtually no one doubted he could have won a third, and possibly served for life, a choice that, more than any flowery rhetoric, taught Americans that presidents are temporary stewards, not permanent fixtures. In his farewell address, printed and read more than it was ever spoken, he warned against permanent foreign entanglements and the corrosive effects of factional parties, not as a neutral philosopher, but as a man trying to hand his successors a manual for keeping the whole contraption from flying apart. Some of his warnings were ignored almost immediately. Others, like the 2-term tradition, hardened into unwritten rules strong enough that when Franklin Roosevelt finally broke them in the 20th century, the country responded by writing Washington's old self-denying choice into the Constitution as the 22nd Amendment. If you strip away the marble statues and dollar bills and just watch his decisions in sequence, what emerges is someone acutely aware that every time he said yes or no, whether to a title, a ceremony, a use of troops, or his own desire to retire, he wasn't just solving a short-term problem, he was etching expectations into the office itself, leaving behind not just a new nation, but a template that every president since, willingly or grudgingly, has had to measure themselves against in the dark. Sleepless hours when the job feels bigger than any one person.